The stagecoach rattled into Pueblo, Colorado on a scorching afternoon in July of 1878, and inside sat a woman whose silence spoke louder than any scream could have. Florence Kendall pressed her gloved hands against her worn traveling dress, watching the dusty streets roll past through the small window. She had traveled for 3 weeks from Philadelphia, each mile taking her further from the life she once knew and closer to a future she could barely imagine. The other passengers had tried to engage her in conversation during the journey, but after receiving only written responses on the small notepad she carried, they had eventually given up. Florence did not blame them. She knew what they thought. They assumed she was born this way, unable to speak. They did not know the truth, that her voice had been stolen from her 6 months ago in a fire that had taken everything. The stagecoach lurched to a stop outside the station, and Florence gathered her single carpet bag. Her hands trembled slightly as she stepped down onto the wooden platform. The heat hit her immediately, dry and intense, so different from the humid summers back east. She stood there for a moment, uncertain, scanning the faces of the people milling about. Somewhere among them was Russell Lawson, the rancher who had answered her letter, the man who had agreed to marry a woman he had never met. Florence pulled out the small photograph he had sent her. The image showed a tall man with broad shoulders, dark hair, and serious eyes. He wore a plain shirt and a weathered hat, looking every bit the frontiersman she had expected. She clutched the photograph tightly, her lifeline in this strange new place. "Miss Kendall." She turned to find the man from the photograph standing before her, even more imposing in person. Russell Lawson stood well over 6 feet tall, with sun-bronzed skin and lines around his eyes that suggested he spent most of his time outdoors. He held his hat in his hands respectfully, and his expression was careful, guarded. Florence nodded, managing a small smile. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. "Welcome to Pueblo," Russell said, his voice deep and measured. "I hope your journey was not too difficult." She reached into her small reticule and pulled out her notepad and pencil, writing quickly. "Thank you for meeting me." The journey was long but uneventful. Russell read the note and nodded slowly. "I received your letter explaining your situation. I want you to know that it makes no difference to me. I am a man of my word, and I intend to honor our agreement." Florence felt a rush of gratitude mixed with apprehension. His words were kind, but his tone was formal, distant. She had not expected warmth, not really, but the reality of her situation suddenly felt overwhelming. She was about to marry a complete stranger, a man who lived in a world she knew nothing about. "My wagon is just over here," Russell said, gesturing toward a sturdy farm wagon hitched to 2 horses. "The ranch is about an hour outside of town. I thought we could get married at the courthouse today if you are agreeable, and then head out before dark. Today." Florence felt her breath catch. She had known this was coming, had prepared herself for it during the long journey west, but hearing the words made it real in a way nothing else had. She nodded again, writing, "That is acceptable." The courthouse ceremony was brief and businesslike. A tired-looking judge read through the vows while Russell and Florence stood side by side. When it came time for Florence to speak, Russell answered for her, his voice steady. "She agrees." The judge seemed only mildly interested in the unusual circumstances, stamping their marriage certificate with practiced efficiency. Within 20 minutes, Florence Kendall had become Florence Lawson, wife of a Colorado rancher, bound to a man whose hand she had just held for the first time. As they climbed into the wagon, Russell cleared his throat. "I should tell you about the ranch. It is not fancy, but it is solid. I have about 200 acres, mostly cattle, some horses. I built the house myself 5 years ago. There are 2 bedrooms, so you will have your privacy until you are comfortable with other arrangements." Florence felt her cheeks warm at the implication. She wrote, "Thank you for your consideration. I am not an unreasonable man, Mrs. Lawson," Russell said, snapping the reins to get the horses moving. "I understand this situation is difficult for both of us. I will try to make it as easy as possible." The ride to the ranch gave Florence her first real look at Colorado. The landscape was nothing like Pennsylvania, with its rolling green hills and dense forests. Here, everything seemed vast and open, stretching endlessly under a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still dusted with snow even in summer. Scrub brush and prairie grass covered the ground, dotted occasionally with clusters of cottonwood trees. It was beautiful in a stark, lonely way that made Florence's chest ache. Russell did not speak much during the ride, but Florence caught him glancing at her occasionally, his expression thoughtful. She wondered what he was thinking, whether he regretted his decision to send for a mail-order bride. She knew from his letters that he was 32 years old, had never been married, and had been ranching on his own since his father died 4 years ago. He had written that he needed a wife to help with the household duties and to provide companionship. It was a practical arrangement, nothing more. The ranch came into view as the sun began to lower in the sky. The house was indeed modest, a single-story wooden structure with a front porch and a stone chimney. Near it stood a barn, a corral with several horses and various outbuildings. Cattle grazed in the distance, dark shapes against the golden grass. "Here we are," Russell said, pulling the wagon to a stop. "Let me show you inside." The interior of the house was clean and surprisingly well kept for a bachelor. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table, and simple furniture. Russell showed her the 2 bedrooms, the smaller one clearly prepared for her arrival with fresh linens on the bed and a washstand in the corner. "I know it is not what you are used to," Russell said, standing awkwardly in the doorway, "but I hope it will suit." Florence set down her carpetbag and turned to face him, writing, "It is more than adequate, thank you." "I will leave you to settle in," Russell said. "I need to check on the animals. There is food in the kitchen if you are hungry. I will be back in about an hour." After he left, Florence sat on the edge of the bed and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. She was married. She was in Colorado. She was hundreds of miles from everything she had ever known. And she was trapped in a silence that felt more suffocating with each passing day. She thought back to that terrible night in March, the night that had changed everything. The fire had started in the theater where she worked as a seamstress. She had been in the costume room on the 3rd floor when she smelled smoke. By the time she realized what was happening, the flames had already engulfed the stairwell. She had tried to scream for help, had opened her mouth and felt the hot smoke pour down her throat, burning and choking her. She had managed to escape through a window, climbing down a trellis while the building blazed behind her. But when she woke up in the hospital 3 days later, her voice was gone. The doctors said the damage to her throat was severe, that she might never speak again. They said it was the trauma, both physical and mental, that had locked her voice away. Florence pulled herself from the memory and stood up. She could not afford to dwell on the past. She had made her choice to come here to start over. She would make the best of it. Over the next few days, Florence began to establish a routine. She woke early to prepare breakfast, cleaned the house, tended to the small vegetable garden behind the barn, and prepared dinner. Russell worked long hours with the cattle, often leaving before dawn and returning after sunset. They ate their meals together in silence, Russell occasionally attempting conversation and Florence responding with her notepad. The exchanges were polite but distant, two strangers navigating an awkward arrangement. On the fourth day, Russell came in for lunch looking frustrated. He sat down heavily at the table and ran a hand through his hair. "I am sorry," he said. "I know I am not making this easy for you. I am not used to having someone else around. I have forgotten how to talk to people, I think." Florence wrote, "You have been nothing but kind. I am the one who makes things difficult." "That is not true," Russell said firmly. "Your silence does not bother me. I just wish I knew how to communicate with you better. Sometimes I feel like I am talking at you instead of with you." Florence hesitated, then wrote, "Perhaps we could find other ways to communicate, not just words." Russell looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" Florence stood and walked to the window, gesturing for him to follow. She pointed out at the cattle grazing in the distance, then made a gesture as if she were roping something. Then she pointed at Russell with a questioning expression. "Are you asking if I will teach you about ranching?" Russell asked, a hint of surprise in his voice. Florence nodded enthusiastically. "Well," Russell said, a small smile forming, "I suppose I could use the help, and it would give us something to do together. Are you sure you want to learn? It is hard work." Florence wrote, "I want to be useful. I want to be a real partner, not just a housekeeper." Something shifted in Russell's expression, a softening around his eyes. "All right then. We will start tomorrow morning, but I am warning you, cattle are stubborn creatures." Florence smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, and Russell felt something warm unfurl in his chest. The next morning, Russell woke Florence before dawn. She dressed quickly in the simplest dress she owned and met him outside. He had saddled two horses, a large bay gelding for himself and a smaller chestnut mare. "This is Cinnamon," Russell said, patting the mare's neck. "She is gentle and well-trained. Do you know how to ride?" Florence shook her head, feeling suddenly nervous. "Then that will be the first lesson," Russell said. He spent the next half hour showing her how to mount, how to hold the reins, how to sit properly in the saddle. He was patient and thorough, his hands steady when he helped her up, his voice calm when he explained each step. Florence found herself intensely aware of his proximity, the strength in his hands, the way he smelled of leather and sage. They rode out slowly, Russell keeping pace beside her. The morning air was cool and fresh, the sky painted in shades of pink and gold. Florence felt a rush of exhilaration as Cinnamon moved beneath her, powerful and alive. She had never experienced anything like this in the city. "We will check the herd first," Russell explained. "Make sure none have wandered off overnight. Then we need to inspect the fences on the north pasture. A storm came through last week, and I have not had time to check for damage." As they rode, Russell pointed out various features of the land, explaining his ranching operation. Florence listened intently, watching his face as he spoke. She realized that when he talked about his work, his entire demeanor changed. The guardedness fell away, replaced by genuine passion and pride. This land meant everything to him. When they reached the herd, Russell dismounted and gestured for Florence to do the same. He showed her how to count the cattle, how to look for signs of illness or injury, how to recognize his brand. Florence took notes on a small pad she had brought along, determined to remember everything. "The key to good ranching is observation," Russell said, squatting down to examine some tracks in the dirt. "You have to pay attention to the small things. Changes in behavior, unusual tracks, anything out of place. The animals cannot tell you when something is wrong, so you have to learn to read the signs." Florence found herself thinking about those words long after he said them, learning to read the signs. Perhaps that was what they needed to do with each other. Over the following weeks, Florence's education continued. Russell taught her about horses, about reading the weather, about mending fences and caring for sick animals. She learned to rope, though her throws were clumsy at first, and Russell would laugh good-naturedly when she missed. Those laughs were rare and precious, transforming his serious face into something younger and more open. Florence discovered that she loved the work, the physicality of it, the sense of purpose. She grew stronger, her hands developing calluses, her skin tanning despite her bonnet. She also discovered that she had a natural way with the horses. They responded to her gentle touch, her patience. Russell noticed this and began giving her more responsibility in the stables. "You have a gift," he told her one evening as they brushed down the horses together. "The animals trust you." "That is rare," Florence wrote, "perhaps because I understand what it is like to be voiceless." Russell read the note and was quiet for a long moment. "Will you tell me what happened?" he asked softly. "You do not have to, but I would like to understand." Florence set down her brush and pulled out her notepad. Her hand shook slightly as she wrote. "There was a fire. I worked in a theater in Philadelphia. I was trapped on the third floor. The smoke damaged my throat, but the doctors say it is more than physical. The trauma locked my voice away." "I am sorry," Russell said, and she could hear the genuine sorrow in his voice. "That must have been terrifying." Florence nodded, feeling tears prick at her eyes. She wrote, "I watched 3 people die that night. I could not help them. I could not even scream." Russell reached out and gently took her hand, the first time he had voluntarily touched her beyond the practical needs of teaching. His palm was rough and warm against hers. "You survived," he said. "That takes strength. Do not ever think otherwise." Florence looked up at him, surprised by the intensity in his voice. In the dim light of the stable, with dust motes floating in the air and the horses shuffling peacefully in their stalls, she felt something shift between them. This was no longer just a practical arrangement. Something real was beginning to grow. As summer deepened, the bond between Russell and Florence continued to strengthen. They developed their own language of gestures and expressions, a silent communication that grew more nuanced each day. Russell learned to read Florence's face, the subtle shifts in her expression that indicated pleasure, concern, amusement, or sadness. Florence learned to interpret Russell's moods from the set of his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes, the way he held his hat. One evening in early August, they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sun set over the mountains. The air was finally cooling after another scorching day, and a gentle breeze rustled through the cottonwood trees. Russell had brought out his harmonica, something Florence had not seen him do before. "My father taught me to play," he said, turning the instrument over in his hands. "I have not touched it much since he died. Would you mind if I played?" Florence shook her head and settled back in her chair, curious. Russell lifted the harmonica to his lips and began to play. The melody was slow and melancholic, a cowboy's lament that seemed to capture all the loneliness of the vast prairie. Florence closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. It was beautiful and heartbreaking, and she understood in that moment that Russell carried his own sorrows, his own silences. When the song ended, Florence opened her eyes to find Russell watching her. "Did you like it?" he asked. She nodded emphatically, then held out her hand for her notepad. She wrote, "It was beautiful. Please play more." Russell played several more songs as the stars began to appear overhead. Florence found herself relaxing in a way she had not since before the fire. There was something healing about the music, about sitting here with this quiet man who asked nothing of her but her presence. "Florence," Russell said after he had finished playing. It was one of the first times he had used her given name instead of Mrs. Lawson. "I want you to know that I am glad you came here. I know this is not the life you imagined for yourself, but I hope you have found some measure of happiness." Florence felt her heart swell. She wrote quickly, "I have found more than I expected. You have given me a new start, a purpose. I am grateful. You have given me something too, Russell said quietly. This house has been lonely for a long time. Having you here, it makes it feel like a home. They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, and Florence realized with a start that she was falling in love with her husband. It was not the passionate, overwhelming love she had read about in novels. It was something quieter, steadier, built on respect and growing affection and shared sunsets. The following week brought unexpected visitors. Florence was in the garden picking vegetables when she heard the sound of horses approaching. She stood up, shading her eyes, and saw 3 riders coming up the path to the house. Russell emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his pants. "Tom Patterson," Russell called out, his voice warm. "What brings you out this way?" The lead rider, a grizzled man in his 50s, dismounted with a grin. "Heard you got yourself hitched, Lawson. Had to come see for myself if the rumors were true." The other 2 riders, both younger men who Florence guessed were Tom's sons, dismounted as well. Russell gestured for Florence to come over. "Florence, this is Tom Patterson. He owns the ranch to the east. Tom, this is my wife, Florence." Tom swept off his hat and gave a respectful nod. "Pleased to meet you, madam. These are my boys, Jack and Henry." Florence smiled and nodded but did not attempt to speak. She saw the men exchange glances, curiosity evident on their faces. "Florence does not speak," Russell explained calmly. "She was injured in an accident, but she communicates just fine." He looked at Florence with such open affection that she felt her cheeks warm. "Well now," Tom said, recovering quickly. "That is no matter at all. My own late wife was deaf in one ear and we managed just fine for 30 years. Communication is about more than words, I always say." The men stayed for dinner, and Florence was grateful for Russell's easy manner with them. He included her in the conversation, often pausing to let her write responses on her notepad, reading them aloud without any embarrassment. Tom and his sons were ranch hands through and through, full of stories about cattle drives and harsh winters and the changing times in Colorado. "Territory is filling up fast," Tom said, pushing his plate back. 10 years ago, you could go days without seeing another soul. Now there are homesteaders everywhere, fencing off the range. "Progress, I suppose," Russell said, though he did not sound entirely pleased about it. "How are you managing with the drought?" Jack asked. "Our creek is running lower than I have ever seen it." "We are all right for now," Russell replied. "I have a good well, and the stream that runs through the north pasture has not dried up yet, but if we do not get rain soon, it could be a hard winter." Florence listened to this with growing concern. She had not realized water was becoming an issue. She made a mental note to ask Russell about it later. After the Pattersons left, Russell helped Florence with the dishes. "I am sorry if that was overwhelming," he said. "Tom is a good man, but he can be a lot to handle." Florence shook her head and wrote, "They were kind. It was nice to have company." "They will spread the word that I have married," Russell said. "We will probably get more visitors in the coming weeks. Folks around here are curious by nature." Florence wrote, "Are you worried about what they will think?" "Not at all," Russell said firmly. "Let them think what they like. You are my wife, and anyone who has a problem with that can stay off my land." The protectiveness in his voice made Florence's heart skip. She reached out and touched his arm, a simple gesture of gratitude. Russell covered her hand with his own, his eyes searching her face. "Florence," he said, his voice rough, "I know we married for practical reasons, but I want you to know that my feelings have changed. You have become important to me, very important." Florence felt tears spring to her eyes. She wanted desperately to tell him that she felt the same way, that somewhere along the way this arrangement had become real for her too. But the words remained locked inside, as always. Instead, She stepped closer and rested her head against his chest, feeling his arms come around her, strong and steady. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the warm kitchen while the lamp flickered and the night sounds drifted in through the open window. It was not a declaration of love in words, but it was enough. September arrived with cooler temperatures and brilliant blue skies. The aspen trees in the mountains began to turn gold, creating a stunning contrast against the evergreens. Russell had to make a trip to Pueblo for supplies, and he asked Florence if she wanted to come along. "We could make a day of it," he suggested. "Get the supplies, maybe have lunch at the hotel restaurant. I could introduce you to some more people in town." Florence agreed eagerly. She had not been back to Pueblo since the day she arrived, and she was curious to see more of it. They set out early in the wagon, the air crisp and fresh. Russell was in good spirits, pointing out landmarks and telling stories about the area. "That is Badger Creek," he said, indicating a dry riverbed. "In the spring, it floods something fierce. Lost 2 head of cattle to it my first year here. Learned real quick to move the herd to higher ground come March." Pueblo was busier than Florence remembered, the streets crowded with wagons and horses and people going about their business. Russell parked the wagon near the general store and helped Florence down. "Let me introduce you to the Harpers," he said, leading her inside. "They own this place and they are good people." The interior of the store was dim and cool, packed floor to ceiling with goods. A cheerful woman in her 40s stood behind the counter, her face lighting up when she saw Russell. "Russell Lawson, as I live and breathe," she exclaimed. "We heard you got married. Is this your bride?" "It is indeed. Mrs. Harper, this is my wife Florence." "Florence, Dorothy Harper and her husband Marcus." Marcus emerged from the back room, a tall, thin man with spectacles. "Welcome to Pueblo, Mrs. Lawson. We are always pleased to meet new settlers." Florence smiled and nodded. Russell explained her situation briefly, and Dorothy waved a dismissive hand. "Words are overrated anyway," she declared. "Half the men in this town talk too much and say too little. You just let me know if you need anything, dear." Florence found herself warming to Dorothy immediately. As Russell went through his supply list with Marcus, Dorothy took Florence on a tour of the store, pointing out various items and chattering about life in Pueblo. Florence pulled out her notepad to ask about fabric, and Dorothy's eyes lit up. "Oh, do you so? We just got in a shipment of beautiful calico. Let me show you." Before long, Dorothy had pulled out half a dozen bolts of fabric, discussing patterns and possibilities. Florence found herself actually enjoying the interaction, Dorothy's undemanding friendliness making it easy to communicate with gestures and quick notes. "You should come to the church social next month," Dorothy said as she cut fabric for Florence. "It is the first Saturday in October. Everyone comes, and there is music and dancing and enough food to feed an army." Florence glanced at Russell, who had finished with Marcus and was watching them with an amused expression. "We will be there," he said. "Florence loves music." After they finished at the general store, Russell took Florence to the hotel for lunch. The dining room was elegant by frontier standards, with white tablecloths and actual china. As they ate, Russell told her more about Pueblo's history, how it had started as a trading post and grown into a proper town with the arrival of the railroad. "It is changing fast," he said. "When I first came here 8 years ago, it was still rough. Now there is even talk of building a proper school and a library." Florence wrote, "Do you like the changes?" "Some of them," Russell admitted. "I am not one for crowds, but I appreciate having supplies more readily available, and I suppose it is good for the territory to grow. Colorado will be a state before long, mark my words." On the ride home, Florence felt more content than she had in months. The day had been perfect, full of simple pleasures and small connections. She looked over at Russell, his capable hands on the reins, his profile strong against the late afternoon sun. She thought about how much he had come to mean to her, how safe she felt with him. That night, as they prepared for bed, Russell lingered at her door. "Florence," he said softly, "I have been thinking about our arrangement. I know I promised you could have your own room, and I meant that, but I wonder if perhaps you might like to share mine. Not because I expect anything," he added quickly. "Just to be close, to not be separate anymore." Florence's heart raced. She looked into his eyes and saw nervousness there, vulnerability. This strong, self-sufficient man was opening himself to her, offering not just proximity but intimacy. She nodded slowly, then wrote, "I would like that very much." Russell's face broke into a smile, genuine and warm. "Good," he said. "That is good." They took things slowly, both of them nervous in their own ways. Russell was gentle and patient, attentive to Florence's responses. And Florence, who had been locked in silence for so long, found that touch could speak volumes. In the darkness, in the warmth of each other's arms, they communicated in ways that needed no words at all. The days grew shorter as autumn progressed. Russell and Florence worked together to prepare the ranch for winter, storing hay for the cattle, checking and repairing buildings, preserving vegetables from the garden. They moved in harmony now, anticipating each other's needs, comfortable in their shared rhythms. One evening, as Florence was preparing dinner, Russell came in early from the fields. His face was troubled, and Florence immediately sensed something was wrong. She set down her knife and looked at him questioningly. "I need to tell you something," Russell said, sitting down heavily at the table. "I received a letter today, from a lawyer in Denver." Florence felt a chill of apprehension. She sat down across from him, waiting. "It is about my brother," Russell continued. "I never mentioned him because we have not spoken in years. We had a falling out after our father died. Samuel wanted to sell the ranch, move to California. I wanted to keep it. We argued and he left. I have not heard from him since." Florence wrote, "What does the lawyer say?" "Samuel has died," Russell said flatly. "Pneumonia, apparently. He was living in Denver. The thing is, he had a daughter, Sarah. She is 8 years old. Her mother died giving birth to her, and Samuel never remarried. The lawyer says Samuel's last wish was for Sarah to come live with me, with us." Florence felt her mind reeling. A child, an 8-year-old girl who had just lost her father. She wrote, "When will she arrive?" "The lawyer is bringing her next week," Russell said. "Florence, I know this is not what you signed up for. If you want to say no, I will understand. I will make other arrangements." Florence looked at her husband, saw the conflict in his face. She thought about being 8 years old and losing everything. She thought about how Russell had given her a chance when she was desperate and broken. She wrote, "She is family. She belongs here with us." "Are you sure?" Russell asked. "It will change everything. A child is a huge responsibility." Florence reached across the table and took his hand. She wrote, "We will manage, together." Russell squeezed her hand, his eyes suspiciously bright. "Thank you," he whispered. "I do not deserve you." The week before Sarah's arrival was a whirlwind of preparation. Florence cleaned and organized the second bedroom, making it suitable for a young girl. She sewed new curtains and a quilt, wanting the space to feel welcoming. Russell built a small desk and chair, remembering how he had loved having a place to do his schoolwork as a boy. "I do not know anything about raising children," Russell confessed one night as they lay in bed. "What if I am terrible at it?" Florence propped herself up on one elbow and wrote on the notepad she now kept on the nightstand, "We will learn together, just like everything else." The lawyer arrived on a gray October morning, driving a carriage with a small figure huddled in the back. Russell and Florence stood on the porch, waiting. As the carriage stopped, Florence got her first look at Sarah Lawson. The girl was tiny for 8 years old, with dark hair like Russell's and large eyes that looked too old for her face. She wore a black dress that was slightly too big for her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She climbed down from the carriage without help, her movements careful and controlled. "Sarah," Russell said, kneeling down to her level. "I am your Uncle Russell. I am so sorry about your father." Sarah looked at him blankly, showing no emotion. "Hello," she said, her voice flat and polite. Florence felt her heart break a little. She recognized that careful blankness, the protective shell that forms around trauma. This child was drowning in grief and trying desperately not to show it. After the lawyer left, having completed his duty, the three of them stood in the yard, an awkward triangle of uncertainty. Russell cleared his throat. "Sarah, this is my wife, Florence. She's going to help take care of you." Sarah looked at Florence with those two old eyes. "Hello, madam." Florence knelt down, bringing herself to Sarah's level. She smiled warmly and held out her hand. Sarah shook it gravely, her small hand cold in Florence's grip. "Let me show you your room," Russell said. "We fixed it up for you." They went inside, Sarah's small bag containing all her worldly possessions. Florence watched as the girl looked around the house with that same blank expression, showing no reaction to anything. When Russell showed her the bedroom, Sarah simply nodded. "You like it?" Russell asked hopefully. "It is very nice, thank you," Sarah said in that same flat tone. Florence and Russell exchanged worried glances. This was going to be harder than they thought. The first few days were difficult. Sarah was polite to the point of being mechanical, doing exactly as she was told but showing no personality, no spark of childhood joy or curiosity. She ate what was put in front of her, went to bed when told, and spent hours sitting silently in her room, staring out the window. Florence tried everything she could think of to reach the girl. She brought out fabric and showed Sarah how to sew. She made Sarah's favorite foods, learned from casual questions. She sat with Sarah in the evenings, offering silent companionship. But nothing seemed to penetrate the wall Sarah had built around herself. Russell was equally frustrated. He tried to engage Sarah with the animals, thinking she might enjoy the horses as Florence did. But Sarah simply stood by the fence, watching without interest. "I do not know what to do," Russell said to Florence one night. "She is so closed off. How do we help her?" Florence thought for a long moment, then wrote, "Give her time. Let her be sad. Do not try to fix it, just be there." It was the right advice, Florence knew, because it was what Russell had done for her. He had not tried to force her to speak or to be anyone other than who she was. He had simply accepted her and given her space to heal in her own time, so they stopped pushing. They maintained their routines, included Sarah in their daily life, but did not demand reactions or emotions from her. Florence made sure Sarah knew she was welcome but not forced. Russell talked to Sarah about the ranch, about her father as a boy, sharing memories without expecting responses. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. One morning, Florence found Sarah in the kitchen before breakfast, staring at the stove. "Can you teach me to make biscuits?" Sarah asked quietly. "My mother used to make them. I do not remember how." Florence's heart swelled. She nodded eagerly and gestured for Sarah to come closer. Together they mixed flour and butter, Florence's hands guiding Sarah's, showing her how to knead the dough, how to cut the biscuits. Sarah focused intently on the task, and when the biscuits came out of the oven golden and perfect, Florence saw the tiniest smile flicker across the girl's face. After that, Sarah started spending more time in the kitchen with Florence. Florence taught her to cook and sew and preserve food. They communicated mostly through gestures and demonstrations. Sarah asking occasional questions that Florence answered with her notepad. There was something comforting for Sarah, Florence realized, in being with someone who also could not speak. It took away the pressure to fill the silence with words neither of them had. Russell noticed the change too. One evening, he came in to find Florence and Sarah sitting together on the porch, shelling peas. Sarah was actually talking, telling Florence about a book she had read in Denver. "And then the princess escaped from the tower by using her own hair as a rope," Sarah said earnestly. "I think that is very clever, do not you?" Florence nodded enthusiastically and pointed at Sarah's own long hair, then mimed braiding it. Sarah giggled, the first real laugh they had heard from her. "That would take a lot of hair," Sarah said. "My hair is not nearly long enough." Russell stood in the doorway watching them, feeling something warm and fierce grow in his chest, his little makeshift family healing each other. The church social in October was a big event, just as Dorothy Harper had promised. The whole town seemed to turn out, gathering in and around the church building with tables laden with food and a group of men with fiddles and guitars ready to play music. Florence felt nervous as they arrived, Sarah holding her hand tightly. "Do not worry," Russell said. "Everyone is friendly, and if you get overwhelmed, we can leave whenever you want." Dorothy Harper spotted them immediately and bustled over, her face wreathed in smiles. "There you are. And this must be Sarah. What a pretty girl. Sarah, do you like cookies? I made snickerdoodles." Sarah looked up at Florence uncertainly. Florence nodded encouragingly and Sarah managed a small smile. "Yes, madam, thank you." As the afternoon progressed, Florence was pleased to find that people were genuinely welcoming. Several women came to introduce themselves, and Tom Patterson's wife Martha took a special interest in Sarah, introducing her to her grandchildren who were close to Sarah's age. "Why do not you go play with the other children?" Martha suggested gently. "They are starting a game of tag over by the trees." Sarah looked hesitant, but when a girl about her age came over and grabbed her hand, saying, "Come on, we need more players," Sarah allowed herself to be pulled into the game. Florence watched with relief as Sarah actually played, running and laughing with the other children. It was the most animated she had been since arriving. "She is going to be all right," Russell said quietly, standing beside Florence. "We all are." When the music started, couples began to dance. Russell held out his hand to Florence. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Lawson?" Florence hesitated. She had not danced since before the fire, and she was not sure she remembered how. But Russell's eyes were warm and encouraging, so she placed her hand in his. He led her into a simple waltz, guiding her patiently through the steps. Florence found her rhythm quickly, relaxing into his arms. They moved together across the grass, surrounded by their neighbors under the vast Colorado sky. In that moment, Florence felt truly happy, all the pieces of her new life falling into place. "I love you," Russell said quietly, just for her. "I know I have never said it before, but I do." "I love you, Florence." Florence looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears. She pressed her hand to her heart, then to his, the gesture clear. Russell smiled, understanding perfectly. Winter came early that year, the first snow falling in mid-November. Florence and Russell worked hard to ensure everything was prepared. The cattle moved to the south pasture where they would be more sheltered, extra wood chopped and stacked. Sarah helped where she could, her presence adding a new dimension to the household. The girl had truly begun to open up. She talked more now, asking endless questions about the ranch, about Colorado, about Florence and Russell's lives. She had also developed a special bond with Florence, often curling up beside her in the evenings while Russell read aloud from the newspaper or a book. One night, after Russell had gone to check on the animals before bed, Sarah looked up at Florence. "Can I ask you something?" Florence nodded, setting aside her mending. "Does it make you sad that you cannot talk?" Florence considered the question carefully. She picked up her notepad and wrote, "Sometimes. But I have found other ways to communicate, and I have learned that listening is just as important as speaking." Sarah read the note and was quiet for a moment. "I think I understand. Sometimes I do not want to talk either. Sometimes it is too hard to find the right words for how I feel." Florence put her arm around the girl, pulling her close. She wrote, "You can always tell me anything, even if you do not have the words. I will understand." "I miss my papa," Sarah whispered, tears finally coming. "I miss him so much, and I do not know how to stop missing him." Florence held the crying child, rocking her gently. She knew there were no words that could fix that kind of pain, no platitudes that could ease grief. So she simply held Sarah while she cried, offering the comfort of presence and understanding. When Russell came back inside, he found them like that, Sarah asleep in Florence's arms, tear tracks on her cheeks. Florence looked up at him, her own eyes damp, and Russell felt his heart crack open a little more. This woman, his wife, who had her own trauma to bear, was mothering his orphaned niece with such tenderness and strength. He helped Florence carry Sarah to bed, tucking the blankets around her small form. "You are amazing," he whispered to Florence as they tiptoed out. "Have I told you that lately?" Florence smiled and pulled out her ever-present notepad. She wrote, "You show me every day." Christmas that year was the happiest the little ranch house had ever seen. Russell cut down a small pine tree, and they decorated it with strings of popcorn and paper ornaments Sarah made. Florence cooked a feast, and they invited the Pattersons for Christmas dinner. Sarah received a new dress and a doll from Florence and Russell, and her joy was pure and unrestrained. "This is the best Christmas ever," Sarah declared, hugging her doll. "Better than in Denver?" Russell asked, teasing. "Much better," Sarah said seriously, "because I have a family now." Florence felt tears spring to her eyes. She looked at Russell and saw his own eyes glistening. They had become a family, the three of them, bound not just by blood or obligation but by genuine love. As winter deepened, the days settled into a comfortable rhythm. Russell taught Sarah to read better and worked on her arithmetic in the evenings. Florence taught her more about cooking and sewing and keeping house. They all worked together to care for the animals, brave the cold to fetch water and feed, and keep the home fires burning. One particularly cold January evening, they were all sitting by the fire when Sarah suddenly said, "Aunt Florence, you think you will ever talk again?" Russell started to scold her for being rude, but Florence held up a hand. She thought for a moment, then wrote, "I do not know. Maybe someday. But even if I do not, that is all right. I have everything I need." "But do not you want to?" Sarah persisted. "There must be so much you want to say." Florence smiled and wrote, "I say plenty, just in different ways, and you and your uncle have learned to hear me." "We have," Russell agreed, reaching over to take Florence's hand. "We hear you just fine." Later that night, after Sarah had gone to bed, Russell and Florence sat together in front of the dying fire. Russell played his harmonica softly, a gentle melody that spoke of home and contentment. Florence leaned against him, feeling the rumble of his breathing, the warmth of his body. "I never thought I could be this happy," Russell said quietly, setting down the harmonica. "Before you came, I was just existing, going through the motions. You brought life back to this place. To me." Florence picked up her notepad, writing by the dim firelight. "You gave me a reason to live again. You and Sarah. This is the family I thought I had lost forever." Russell pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "Promise me something," he said. "Promise me that even if your voice comes back, you will not change. You will still be exactly who you are." Florence nodded against his chest, understanding what he meant. Her silence had become part of who she was now, but more than that, it had taught them all to communicate in deeper ways. It had taught them to really see each other, to pay attention, to value connection over mere words. Spring came late in 1879, the snow lingering well into April. But when it finally melted, it revealed a world bursting with new life. The grass greened almost overnight, wildflowers bloomed across the prairie, and the cattle grew sleek and healthy on the fresh grazing. Florence planted an ambitious garden that year, with Sarah's help. The girl had grown taller over the winter, losing some of her fragility. She laughed more easily now, and her eyes had regained some of the spark appropriate to childhood. "Can we plant sunflowers?" Sarah asked, bouncing excitedly. "I love sunflowers." Florence nodded and added sunflower seeds to her list for the next trip to town. That trip came in May, all three of them going together in the wagon. Pueblo was bustling with activity, everyone emerging from their winter cocoons. Dorothy Harper was delighted to see them. "My goodness, Sarah, you have grown like a weed," Dorothy exclaimed. "Before you know it, you will be as tall as your aunt." While Russell and Sarah browsed the store, Dorothy pulled Florence aside. "I wanted to ask you something," she said quietly. "The church is looking for someone to help with the children's Sunday school. I know you cannot speak, but I thought perhaps you could still help. The children love you and you have such a gentle way with them." Florence felt a flutter of nervousness but also excitement. She wrote, "I would like that very much." "Wonderful," Dorothy said. "We meet every Sunday at 10. You can start whenever you are ready." On the ride home, Florence told Russell about Dorothy's offer. He was enthusiastic. "That is perfect for you. You are wonderful with children. Sarah adores you." "I do," Sarah piped up from the back of the wagon. "You are the best aunt ever." Florence felt warmth spread through her chest. A year ago, she had been alone and broken, without purpose or hope. Now she had a husband who loved her, a child to care for, a community that accepted her, and meaningful work to do. It was more than she had ever dared to dream. Summer brought its challenges. The drought Tom Patterson had mentioned the previous year intensified. By July, the creek running through Russell's north pasture had dried to a trickle, and the grass was brown and brittle. Russell spent long hours hauling water for the cattle, his face lined with worry. "If we do not get rain soon, I will have to sell some of the herd," he told Florence one night. "I cannot keep them all watered and fed." Florence hated seeing him so stressed. She wished there was more she could do to help. She had taken over as many of the ranch duties as she could, trying to free up his time, but there was only so much that could be done. The rain finally came in August, a blessed thunderstorm that lasted 3 days. The whole ranch seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The grass greened up, the creek swelled, and Russell's worry lines eased. "We will make it through," he said, standing on the porch with his arm around Florence, watching the rain fall. "We always do." That fall, Sarah started attending the small school that had opened in Pueblo. She would ride into town with the Patterson children every Monday morning and stay with the Harpers during the week, coming home on Friday evenings. Florence missed her during those days, but she was pleased to see Sarah thriving, making friends, and getting a proper education. The first week Sarah was gone, the house felt too quiet. Florence and Russell found themselves at loose ends, unused to having so much time alone together. "I never thought I would miss the constant chatter," Russell said with a wry smile. "But I do." Florence nodded in agreement. She had grown accustomed to Sarah's presence, her questions and observations filling the house with life. But the time alone also allowed Florence and Russell to deepen their own relationship. They fell back into their early routines, working side by side during the day and spending long evenings talking. Russell speaking and Florence writing, sharing thoughts and dreams and memories. One evening in late September, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Russell said, "I have been thinking about the future, about expanding the ranch, maybe buying some more land. The Pattersons' eastern pasture might be available. Tom mentioned he is thinking about selling." Florence wrote, "That sounds wonderful. Do we have the money? If we have a good year, yes. It would mean more work, but also more security. And maybe someday we could pass it on to Sarah or to other children if we are blessed with them." Florence felt her heart skip. They had not talked about having children of their own. She wrote, "Would you want that? More children?" Russell turned to look at her, his expression tender. "Yes," he said simply, "if we are blessed with them. But even if we are not, we have Sarah, we have each other. That is enough." Florence leaned into him, feeling a wave of love so strong it almost hurt. This man, who had agreed to marry a stranger out of practical necessity, had become the center of her world. Winter came again, and with it Sarah home for the extended break from school. The house once again filled with noise and activity. They celebrated Christmas with even more joy than the previous year, and Sarah's laughter rang through the house. On New Year's Eve, as 1880 approached, the three of them stayed up late together. Russell played his harmonica while Sarah sang along in her high, clear voice. Florence clapped in rhythm, feeling perfectly content. "I think this is going to be a good year," Sarah announced. "I can feel it." "I think you are right," Russell agreed, pulling both his wife and his niece close. "I think it is going to be wonderful." He was right. The year 1880 brought prosperity to the ranch. The rains came regularly, the cattle thrived, and Russell was able to purchase the Patterson land, expanding his holdings significantly. Florence's garden flourished, and she began selling her excess vegetables and preserves in town, contributing to the household income. Sarah continued to excel in school, showing a particular aptitude for reading and writing. She would often share her lessons with Florence in the evenings. The two of them bent over books together. In May, Florence realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had not wanted to say anything until she was certain. When she finally told Russell, writing the news carefully on her notepad with shaking hands, he actually whooped with joy, sweeping her up in his arms and spinning her around. "We are having a baby," he shouted. "Sarah, we are having a baby." Sarah came running from her room, her face alight with excitement. "Really? I am going to be a big cousin." "You are," Florence wrote, her own face glowing with happiness. The months of pregnancy were both wonderful and challenging. Florence experienced morning sickness and fatigue, but Russell and Sarah took excellent care of her, insisting she rest while they handled the household chores. Russell was almost comically protective, worrying about her every move. "I am pregnant, not broken," Florence wrote after he had tried to stop her from hanging laundry. "I know," Russell said sheepishly. "I just want to make sure you and the baby are safe." Florence softened and took his hand, placing it on her growing belly. She loved seeing his face light up every time he felt the baby move. Sarah was equally excited, constantly talking to Florence's belly, telling the baby stories and singing songs. "I am going to be the best cousin ever," she declared. "I will teach the baby everything I know." In December, when the first snows had begun to fall, Florence went into labor. Russell sent Sarah to fetch Mrs. Harper, who had experience as a midwife, while he stayed with Florence, holding her hand and trying to hide his terror. "You are going to be fine," he kept saying, more to himself than to her. "Everything is going to be fine." Florence wished she could reassure him with words, but all she could do was grip his hand and focus on breathing through the contractions. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Mrs. Harper remained calm and competent throughout, offering encouragement and guidance. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, Florence gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Russell cried when he held his son for the first time, tears streaming down his weathered face. "He is perfect," Russell whispered. "Absolutely perfect." They named him James after Russell's father. Sarah was instantly smitten with her new cousin, insisting on helping with everything. Florence watched her little family with overwhelming love, still hardly able to believe this was her life now. The winter passed in a blur of feedings and diaper changes and sleepless nights. Florence was exhausted but happier than she had ever been. Russell was a devoted father, getting up with the baby so Florence could sleep, carrying James around in a sling while he did his chores. "I never knew I could love something this much," Russell confessed one night, watching James sleep in his cradle. "He is so small, so helpless. It terrifies me." Florence wrote, "You are a wonderful father. He is lucky to have you." "We are all lucky to have each other," Russell said, pulling Florence close. As James grew, the house became even more chaotic. A crawling baby determined to explore everything kept them all on their toes. Sarah was patient and gentle with her cousin, reading him stories and playing with him for hours. In the spring of 1882, when James was a year and a half old, Florence discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Russell was still protective but less panicked, and Sarah was thrilled at the prospect of another baby. "I hope it is a girl this time," Sarah said, who was now 12 and increasingly interested in typical feminine pursuits. "Then I can help her with her hair and teach her to sew." In October, Florence gave birth to a daughter. The labor was shorter and easier than with James, and by evening Florence was holding a red-faced, squalling baby girl. "She has your determination," Russell said with a laugh, watching his daughter's lusty cries. "Strong-willed from the start." They named her Rose, and she was indeed strong-willed. Even as an infant, she made her preferences known with volume and persistence. But she was also affectionate, cuddling close to Florence and reaching for Russell with chubby hands. With 2 young children, life on the ranch was busier than ever. Florence often thought back to that woman who had arrived in Pueblo 4 years earlier, silent and broken, and marveled at the transformation. She had never imagined she could be this happy, this fulfilled. One evening, when Rose was about 6 months old and James was playing with blocks on the floor, Florence was preparing dinner while Russell held the baby. Sarah was at the table doing her homework. It was a perfectly ordinary moment, domestic and unremarkable. But as Florence looked around at her family, she felt such a swell of gratitude that she had to stop and steady herself against the counter. Russell noticed immediately. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern in his voice. Florence nodded, smiling. She picked up her notepad and wrote, "I am more than all right. I am exactly where I am meant to be." Russell read the note, then came over and kissed her gently. "So am I," he said. "So am I." The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own challenges and joys. The ranch continued to prosper, Russell's hard work and smart decisions paying off. Sarah grew into a beautiful and intelligent young woman, graduating from the Pueblo school at 15 and beginning to work as a teacher's assistant. James was a curious, energetic boy who followed his father everywhere, determined to learn everything about ranching. Rose was indeed strong-willed but also kind-hearted, with a natural way with animals that reminded Russell of Florence. In 1885, when Florence was 30 years old, she gave birth to their 3rd child, another boy they named Thomas. Russell had worried about another pregnancy, concerned for Florence's health, but she had assured him she was strong enough. And she was. Thomas was an easy baby, good-natured and adaptable, fitting seamlessly into the bustling household. Sarah, now 17, was courting a young man named Daniel who worked at the bank in Pueblo. Russell had given his reluctant approval, though he grumbled about losing his niece. "I am not going anywhere," Sarah assured him. "Daniel wants to stay in Pueblo. We will only be an hour away." Florence was happy for Sarah but would miss having her around. The girl had been such an important part of their family, healing alongside them, bringing her own special light to their lives. The wedding took place in the spring of 1886, a beautiful ceremony at the church in Pueblo. Sarah was a radiant bride, and Daniel was clearly devoted to her. Florence watched with tears in her eyes as Russell walked Sarah down the aisle, remembering the broken, silent child who had arrived at the ranch 6 years earlier. At the reception, Sarah sought out Florence. "Thank you," she said, taking Florence's hands. "Thank you for loving me when I did not think I could be loved again. You showed me that families are not just about blood, they are about the people who choose to stay." Florence hugged the girl tightly, wishing she could tell her how much she had come to mean to them, how much joy she had brought. But Sarah understood. She always had. Life settled into a new normal with Sarah married and living in town. Florence found herself with a bit more time as James was now old enough to attend school and Rose was becoming more independent. She increased her involvement with the Sunday school and began teaching some of the women in town how to preserve food and garden in the challenging Colorado climate. Russell had become something of a respected figure in the community, known for his integrity and his successful ranch. He was occasionally asked to mediate disputes or offer advice to newer settlers. He always downplayed his role, but Florence was proud of the man he was, the leader he had become. One evening in the fall of 1887, as they sat on the porch after getting the children to bed, Russell said, "It has been 9 years since you arrived in Pueblo. Do you remember that day?" Florence nodded. How could she forget? She had been so frightened, so uncertain. "I was terrified," Russell admitted. "I had no idea what I was doing. I had never even courted a woman properly, and suddenly I was getting married to a stranger." Florence pulled out her notepad, always close at hand even after all these years. She wrote, "I was terrified too. I thought I would never be whole again." "But you were whole," Russell said, taking her hand. "You just had to find a new way to be yourself, and in the process you taught me what really matters. Not words, but actions. Not what we say, but how we show up for each other." Florence felt tears prick at her eyes. She wrote, "You healed me. You and this life we built together." "We healed each other," Russell corrected. "I was lonely and closed off before you came. You opened my heart again." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, holding hands, listening to the evening sounds of the ranch. Florence thought about all the moments that had brought them to this point. The small kindnesses, the gradual building of trust, the way they had learned to communicate without words. It had not been easy, but it had been worth it. In 1888, Sarah gave birth to her first child, a daughter named Florence after her aunt. When Russell and Florence came to visit, bringing the children with them, Sarah placed the baby in Florence's arms. "I want her to be like you," Sarah said softly. "Strong and kind and brave. Will you be her godmother?" Florence could only nod, too overcome with emotion to even write. She looked down at the tiny baby named in her honor and felt the weight of the gift Sarah was giving her. As the years passed, Florence's hair began to show threads of silver, and Russell's temples went gray. Their children grew and thrived. James showed every sign of becoming the rancher his father was. Rose announced her intention to become a teacher like Sarah. Young Thomas was still finding his way, but he had inherited his father's quiet strength and his mother's gentle nature. The ranch continued to prosper, expanding further as Russell purchased additional land and increased his herd. They had become one of the most successful ranching operations in the area, their cattle known for their quality. Florence's reputation as a gardener and cook had spread throughout the region. Women came from miles around to buy her seedlings and learn her techniques. She had developed an efficient system of communication, using illustrated diagrams and demonstrations to teach. Her silence, once a source of shame and isolation, had become simply a characteristic, accepted and accommodated by everyone who knew her. In 1890, Pueblo celebrated Colorado's 14th year of statehood with a big festival. The whole Lawson family attended, including Sarah and her growing family. There was music and dancing, food and games, a celebration of community and prosperity. Florence stood with Russell, watching their children play with their cousins and friends. Sarah came to stand beside them, her own daughter perched on her hip. "Did you ever imagine this?" Sarah asked. "When you first came here, did you think your life would turn out like this?" Florence pulled out her notepad and wrote, "I could not have imagined anything this wonderful." "Neither could I," Sarah said. "When Papa died and they sent me here, I thought my life was over, but it was really just beginning." Russell put his arms around both women. "We have been blessed," he said simply. "All of us." That night, as they drove home in the wagon, the children asleep in the back, Russell said, "Florence, there is something I have wanted to ask you for years, but I have never quite found the right time." Florence looked at him curiously, waiting. "Do you ever regret it? Answering my advertisement, leaving Philadelphia? Sometimes I wonder if you would have been happier staying in the East, maybe finding a way to get your voice back through some treatment or doctor." Florence thought carefully about her answer. Finally, she wrote, "I left behind a life that was destroyed by tragedy. You gave me a new life filled with purpose and love. I have never regretted it for a single moment. As for my voice, I realized something over the years. I do not need it to be heard. You hear me. The children hear me. Everyone who matters hears me just fine." Russell read the note by the light of the moon, his vision blurring with tears. "I hear you," he said softly. "I have always heard you." When they got home, Russell carried the sleeping children inside while Florence lingered on the porch for a moment. She looked out at the ranch, bathed in moonlight, the mountains' dark shapes against the star-filled sky. The land that had seemed so foreign and frightening 12 years ago now felt like home in the deepest sense of the word. She thought about that terrified woman on the stagecoach, silent and alone, traveling toward an unknown future. If she could go back and tell that woman what was waiting for her, what would she say? That she would find love, that she would build a family, that she would discover strength she never knew she had. No, Florence thought. She would tell that woman to trust, to take the leap, to believe that even in silence, even in brokenness, there is the possibility of wholeness. That sometimes the things we think are our greatest weaknesses become our greatest strengths. The years continued their steady march. In 1892, Rose began attending the Teachers' College in Denver, following Sarah's footsteps. James took on more responsibility at the ranch, working alongside his father with growing skill and confidence. Thomas, at 9 years old, showed signs of becoming a talented artist, filling notebooks with sketches of the ranch and the animals. Sarah had given them 3 more grandchildren by then, and the extended family gathered regularly for dinners and celebrations. The house that Russell had built for himself, thinking he would live and die alone, was now constantly filled with the noise and chaos of a large, loving family. In the spring of 1893, on their 15th wedding anniversary, Russell took Florence on a trip, just the two of them. They traveled to Denver, staying in a fine hotel and seeing the sights of the growing city. It was the first time they had been alone together for more than a day since before James was born. On their last evening, they had dinner at an elegant restaurant, Florence wearing a new dress that Russell had bought for her. As they ate, Russell raised his glass. "To 15 years," he said. "To the best decision I ever made." Florence smiled and raised her own glass, touching it to his. She pulled out her notepad and wrote, "To the man who learned to hear my heart." Russell read it and reached across the table to take her hand. "You know," he said, "I think I fell in love with you that first day watching you step off that stagecoach. You looked so brave, even though I could see you were terrified. I thought to myself, this woman has courage." Florence shook her head and wrote, "I was not brave. I was desperate." "Maybe," Russell conceded, "but you turned that desperation into determination. You built a life here through sheer will and kindness. That takes courage." They walked back to the hotel through Denver's gaslit streets, arm in arm. Florence marveled at how much the world had changed since she had first come west. There were telephones now and electric lights in the cities and talk of horseless carriages. But some things remained constant: love, family, the land. When they returned home, they were greeted with enthusiasm by the children, and with the news that Sarah was expecting her 5th child. Life continued its relentless, beautiful pace. In 1895, James at 15 announced that he wanted to expand into horse breeding as well as cattle ranching. Russell was supportive, helping James research bloodlines and purchase their first breeding stock. Father and son worked closely together, their bond deepening as James matured into young adulthood. Rose had graduated from Teachers College and taken a position at the Pueblo school, living with Sarah and Daniel during the week. She was courting a young lawyer named William, and Russell was already grumbling about losing his little girl. "You do not lose them," Florence wrote. "They just expand our family." Thomas, at 12, had discovered a love of music and was learning to play the guitar from a ranch hand who worked for them. The house often echoed with his practicing, not always melodious but always enthusiastic. In the fall of that year, Dorothy Harper fell ill. Florence spent weeks nursing her friend, sitting with her for hours, providing comfort and care. When Dorothy passed away in October, Florence felt the loss deeply. Dorothy had been one of the first people to truly see her, to accept her without question. At the funeral, Dorothy's daughter approached Florence. "Mother wanted you to have this," she said, holding out Dorothy's recipe book. "She always said you were the daughter she never had. She would want you to continue her legacy." Florence accepted the book with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. She thought about how Dorothy had welcomed her to Pueblo all those years ago, how she had never made Florence feel less than because of her silence. She had been a true friend. Russell held Florence that night while she cried, understanding that she was mourning not just Dorothy, but also processing the accumulation of losses in her life. The people she had lost in Philadelphia, her old voice, her former self. But she had gained so much more than she had lost. The turn of the century brought both celebration and reflection. On New Year's Eve 1899, the whole family gathered at the ranch to mark the transition to 1900. 3 generations sat around the table, from Sarah's oldest children, now teenagers, to her youngest, a toddler. James had brought his sweetheart, a rancher's daughter named Elizabeth. Rose and William had announced their engagement. Thomas, at 17, was talking about studying art in Denver. Russell stood and raised his glass. 22 years ago," he said, "I made the best decision of my life. I sent for a mail-order bride because I needed help on the ranch. What I got was so much more. I got a partner, a best friend, the love of my life. Florence, You have made me the happiest man alive. To you and to the beautiful family we have built together." Everyone raised their glasses, calling out to Florence. "And to family." Florence felt her eyes fill with tears of joy. She looked around the table at all these people, this large, loud, loving family that had grown from that one desperate decision to leave Philadelphia and start over. She thought about that silent, broken woman on the stagecoach and wished she could tell her that everything would be okay. More than okay. That she would find not just a husband but a true partner, not just a home but a place where she belonged. Not just survival but a life rich with meaning and love. In 1901, James married Elizabeth in a beautiful ceremony at the ranch. The same year, Rose married William and moved to a nearby town where he had opened a law practice. Thomas left for Denver to pursue his art, though he came home regularly, bringing new sketches and paintings to show the family. Russell and Florence found themselves entering a new phase of life. With the children grown and gone, the house was quieter than it had been in years. But they were not alone. Sarah's children often came to stay, and there was still the constant work of the ranch to keep them busy. One evening, sitting on the porch as they had done countless times over the years, Russell said, "I have been thinking about writing a book. About ranching, about this area, about our experiences. I thought maybe you could help me. You always were good at organizing thoughts on paper." Florence liked the idea. Over the next several months, they worked on it together, Russell dictating his experiences and knowledge while Florence organized and edited, adding her own observations and insights. It became a collaborative project, a way of preserving their history and sharing what they had learned. The book was published in 1903 by a regional press, titled Making a Life in Colorado, Ranching and Family on the Frontier. It was well received, particularly among other ranchers and settlers who appreciated the practical advice mixed with personal stories. There was a chapter about communication and partnership that Florence had written, discussing how she and Russell had built their relationship despite her inability to speak. It resonated with many readers. As Florence entered her late 40s, she found herself thinking more about legacy. What would she leave behind? How would she be remembered? She realized that her legacy was not in words spoken or written, but in the lives she had touched. Her children, her grandchildren, the students she had taught, the women she had helped. Her garden, which continued to produce abundantly, teaching that with proper care and attention, even the harshest environment could bloom. Her marriage, which had shown that love could grow in unexpected ways, that partnership was about much more than words. In 1905, Sarah's oldest daughter, young Florence, now 17, came to stay at the ranch for the summer. She had always been close to her namesake, and the two spent hours together, Florence teaching her niece everything she knew about gardening, cooking, and running a household. One afternoon, as they worked in the garden together, young Florence said, "Aunt Florence, can I ask you something personal?" Florence nodded, wiping dirt from her hands. "You ever wish you could speak? I mean, you communicate so well without it, but do you miss it?" Florence thought carefully, then pulled out her ever-present notepad. She wrote, "Sometimes I wonder what my voice sounded like. I have almost forgotten, but I do not miss speaking the way I thought I would. I have found that silence can be powerful too. It makes people listen more carefully. It makes me observe more closely, and it has taught me that there are many ways to be heard." Young Florence read this and nodded thoughtfully. "You are the strongest person I know," she said. "I want to be like you when I grow up." Florence pulled the girl into a hug, feeling a rush of love and gratitude. This young woman, named in her honor, saw her not as broken or damaged but as strong. It was a gift beyond measure. Russell turned 55 in 1906, and Florence surprised him with a party. All their children came home, bringing their families. Sarah and Daniel drove out from Pueblo with their entire brood. James and Elizabeth, now parents to 2 sons, brought the boys who immediately ran off to see the horses. Rose and William came with their new baby daughter. Thomas arrived from Denver with his fiancée, an artist like himself. The house and yard filled with laughter and noise, children running everywhere, adults catching up on news and gossip. Florence moved through the crowd, refilling plates and cups, making sure everyone was comfortable. She caught Russell's eye across the yard and he smiled at her, that warm, loving smile that still made her heart skip after all these years. "You did good, Florence," Sarah said, coming to stand beside her. "Look at all of this. This family, this life. You built this." Florence wrote, "We all built it together." "Maybe," Sarah said, "but you were the foundation. You showed us what love and persistence and strength look like." As the sun set and the party continued with music and dancing, Florence stood with Russell, his arm around her waist. "Happy birthday," she wrote on her notepad. "Happiest birthday of my life," Russell said. "Every year with you is a gift." The years that followed were good ones. The ranch continued to thrive under Russell and James's joint management. The grandchildren grew and flourished. Florence's garden became something of a local landmark, people coming from all over to see it and learn from her. In 1908, Florence turned 50. She marveled at the fact that she had now lived 30 years, more than half her life, in silence. It no longer felt like a loss. It was simply who she was. That summer, as she worked in her garden with Russell nearby mending a fence, Florence felt something shift inside her. A warmth in her throat, a tingling sensation she had not felt in decades. She gasped, pressing her hand to her neck. Russell looked up immediately, alert to her distress. "Florence, what is wrong?" She shook her head, unable to explain. The sensation passed after a moment, leaving her shaken. She tried to write what she had felt, but the words seemed inadequate. Over the next few days, the sensation returned occasionally, always brief, always startling. Florence began to wonder if something was changing. After 30 years, could her voice be returning? She tried, alone in the house when no one else was around. She opened her mouth and pushed air from her lungs, trying to form sounds. At first, nothing came, but after several attempts she heard it. A whisper of sound, barely audible but real. Florence's heart pounded. She tried again. Russ. The sound was rough and weak, her vocal cords unused for so long. But it was there. She sat down heavily, overwhelmed. After 30 years of silence, her voice was returning. But the question was, did she want it to? She thought about what she had written to young Florence, about the power of silence, about the ways she had learned to communicate. She thought about the life she had built without words. If her voice came back, would it change everything? That evening, she showed Russell what she had discovered. She opened her mouth and with great effort managed to say his name. Russell. His eyes widened in shock. "Florence, you actually spoke," she nodded, tears running down her face. "This is wonderful," Russell said, pulling her into his arms. "Your voice is coming back." But Florence pulled away and grabbed her notepad. She wrote, "I am not sure I wanted to." Russell looked confused. "What do you mean?" "This is what the doctors said might happen, that the trauma might heal over time. This is a good thing," Florence wrote, "but who will I be if I can speak again? My silence has become part of me. Our communication, the way we understand each other, it is based on this. What if speaking changes everything?" Russell took the notepad from her and set it aside. He held her face in his hands, looking into her eyes. "Florence Lawson, I fell in love with you when you were silent. If you speak again, I will love you just the same. Nothing changes between us unless we let it. You are not your voice or your silence. You are you." kind, strong, loving, brilliant. Whether you speak or do not speak makes no difference to me." Florence felt the truth of his words settle over her. He was right. Her voice did not define her. Its absence had taught her important lessons, had shaped her in meaningful ways, but its return would not erase any of that. Over the following weeks, Florence practiced speaking in private. The sounds came easier with time, though her voice was rough and scratchy from disuse. She worked to strengthen it, rediscovering how to form words, how to shape sounds. She did not tell anyone else, wanting to wait until she could speak properly. It was strange and wonderful to hear her own voice again, even if it did not sound quite like she remembered. She was 50 years old now, and her voice was the voice of a middle-aged woman, not the young seamstress from Philadelphia. Finally, on a Sunday evening when the whole family was gathered for dinner, Florence decided it was time. Her hands shook as she stood up at the head of the table. Russell, who knew what was coming, reached over and squeezed her hand reassuringly. Florence cleared her throat. Everyone looked at her curiously, used to her getting their attention with gestures or by tapping a glass. "I have something to say," Florence said, her voice rough but clear. The room erupted. Sarah dropped her fork. James stood up so fast he knocked over his chair. Rose burst into tears. The grandchildren stared in confusion, having never known their grandmother to speak. "Mama," Sarah whispered, "you can talk." "I can," Florence said, each word still feeling strange and new on her tongue. "My voice has been returning gradually. I wanted to practice before I told you all." The family surrounded her, everyone talking at once, asking questions, crying, laughing. Florence felt overwhelmed but also filled with joy. This was her family, the people she loved most in the world, celebrating with her. But that evening, after everyone had left and she and Russell were alone, Florence said, "I want you to know something. I am glad my voice came back. But I do not regret the years of silence. They taught me things I needed to learn. They brought me here to you, to this life. I would not change any of it." "Neither would I," Russell said. "Those years taught me to listen with more than my ears, to see with more than my eyes. You taught me that." In the months that followed, Florence gradually began using her voice more, though she still often preferred her notepad for private communications with Russell. Old habits were hard to break, and there was something intimate about their written conversations that she was not ready to give up entirely. The community in Pueblo was amazed by her recovery. Many saw it as a miracle, a testament to the power of time and healing. Florence simply saw it as one more chapter in a life filled with unexpected turns. As the years passed, Florence found a balance. She spoke when it was practical or necessary, but she did not become chatty or verbose. Her long silence had taught her the value of carefully chosen words. When Florence Lawson spoke, people listened, because they knew she would not waste their time with meaningless chatter. In 1910, James and Elizabeth welcomed their third child, a daughter they named Florence. "We have to carry on the tradition," James said with a grin. "Besides, I want my daughter to grow up knowing about her grandmother's strength." Russell officially retired from ranching in 1912, turning over the operation fully to James. He and Florence finally had time to travel, visiting Thomas in Denver, spending weeks with Rose and her family, going on trips they had always dreamed about but never had time for. On their 34th wedding anniversary in 1912, they returned to the spot where the ranch house stood, looking out over the land they had built together. Russell was 61 now, his hair silver, his face deeply lined. Florence was 54, her own hair gray, her hands showing the wear of decades of work. "You remember the day you arrived?" Russell asked, his arm around her waist. "You looked so small and frightened climbing down from that stagecoach." I remember being terrified, Florence said, her voice still carrying that slight roughness that never quite went away. I thought I was making the biggest mistake of my life. And it was the best decision I ever made, Florence said firmly. You gave me everything, Russell. A home, a family, purpose, love. You taught me that I was not broken, just different. You learned to hear my heart when I had no voice. You taught me what really matters, Russell said. Not the words we say, but the lives we build. Not the voice we have, but the way we use it, whether through speech or silence or action. They stood together as the sun set, painting the Colorado sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. The mountains stood eternal in the distance, the land spread out before them. Somewhere in the house, photographs chronicled their life together. 3 children, numerous grandchildren, and now even great-grandchildren. A legacy built not on words, but on love and work and commitment. Florence thought about that broken woman who had arrived in Pueblo 34 years ago, unable to speak, unable to imagine a future. She thought about the cowboy who had sent for a mail-order bride out of loneliness and practicality, not expecting to find love. And she marveled at how life could surprise you, how the things you think will destroy you can actually lead you to your greatest joy. I love you, Florence said, the words she had been unable to speak for so long now flowing easily. I have loved you from the beginning, even when I could not say it. I know, Russell said, kissing her softly. I heard you anyway. I always heard you. As darkness fell and they walked back to the house together, hand in hand as they had done for 3 decades, Florence felt complete peace. Her life had not turned out the way she had planned. It had been so much better. She had lost her voice but found herself. She had come west as a desperate stranger and built a family, a home, a legacy. The years continued to unfold gently. Russell and Florence grew older together, their love deepening with each passing season. They became the patriarch and matriarch of a sprawling family, their house always open, their wisdom sought. Florence continued her garden until she was nearly 70, only stopping when arthritis made the work too painful. Russell continued to advise James on the ranch, his knowledge and experience invaluable. In 1918, the world was at war, and the ranch, like all of America, felt the impact. Their grandson, Sarah's oldest son, enlisted and went overseas. The family gathered at the ranch to pray for his safe return, Florence's voice joining the others for the first time in communal prayer. When he returned home in 1919, safely but changed by what he had seen, it was to Florence he came first, seeking the comfort of her embrace and the wisdom she had gained through her own trauma. It changes you, he said. What you see, what you experience. I do not know how to go back to the way things were. Florence held his hands and looked into his young face, seeing the shadows of old pain. You do not go back, she said gently. You go forward. You build something new from what you have learned. Pain can destroy us or it can teach us. The choice is ours. In 1923, Russell and Florence celebrated their 45th wedding anniversary. The celebration was smaller, more intimate, just their children and closest grandchildren. Russell's health had been declining, his heart growing weak. But his spirit remained strong, his love for Florence unwavering. 45 years, he said, holding her hand. Best years of my life. Mine too, Florence said, her own health still relatively good. Every single one of them. That winter was hard. Russell grew weaker, spending more time in bed. The doctor could do little except make him comfortable. Florence rarely left his side, reading to him, talking to him, holding his hand. They spoke of their life together, remembering the best moments, laughing over old stories. Do you think, Russell asked one night, that if I had married someone else, someone who could speak from the beginning, we would have been as happy. No, Florence said honestly, because we would not have learned to truly listen to each other. My silence forced us to communicate in deeper ways. It was a gift, even though it did not feel like one at the time. You were the gift, Russell said, the greatest gift I ever received. Russell Lawson passed away peacefully in his sleep in February of 1924, with Florence holding his hand. He was 72 years old and had spent 45 years loving his mail-order bride who had arrived silent and scared and became the center of his world. Florence grieved deeply, but not hopelessly. She had lost her partner, her best friend, the man who had taught her to live again. But she knew she would be all right. He had given her that strength, had shown her that she was capable of more than she ever imagined. She continued to live on the ranch, now run entirely by James and his sons. She tended a smaller garden, spent time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and wrote down the stories of her life, wanting future generations to know where they came from. In 1928, at 70 years old, Florence published her own book, a memoir titled Silent Years, Speaking Heart, A Life in Colorado. It told the story of her journey from Philadelphia, the fire that took her voice, her marriage to Russell, and the life they built together. It was honest and heartfelt, and it resonated with readers across the country. Women wrote to her, thanking her for showing that strength could come in many forms, that a disability did not have to define you. Florence lived until 1934, dying peacefully at the age of 76, surrounded by her children. Her legacy lived on in the dozens of descendants she left behind, in the ranch that still thrived, in the gardens that bloomed each spring using the techniques she had taught, in the books that preserved her story. On her gravestone, placed next to Russell's in the small cemetery outside Pueblo, her children had these words inscribed: Florence Kendall Lawson, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, she taught us that love speaks louder than words. Years later, her great-great-grandchildren would visit that gravestone and ask about the woman who lay beneath it. And they would be told the story of a mail-order bride who came west in silence and built a legacy of love, of a cowboy who learned to hear her heart, and of a family that grew from one brave decision to start over. It was a love story for the ages, proving that the deepest communication comes not from words spoken, but from hearts truly heard.